All right, I would like to go through a couple more examples on how to figure out the trig values without the use of your calculator, but if you have a sine or cosine or tangent in radians. So let's just start with the sine of 5 pi over 6. All right, so if you remember, the step one is always to draw it out. So that will be the first thing you want to do. So again, I know that this here would be pi, and this here would be 2 pi, but I want to do it in terms of 6. So I'm going to call this 6 pi over 6, and I'm going to call this 12 pi over 6. Well, if this is 0 to 6 pi over 6, I know this here would be 3 pi over 6. And so here to here, I'm adding 3. I'm adding 3. If I add 3 more pi over 6 here, this would be 9 pi over 6. Well, now I have it all drawn out in terms of 6. Well, I know 5 pi over 6 is going to be between 3 and 6. So 5 pi over 6 will be somewhere over here in the second quadrant. Again, I don't really care exactly where you place it. It's more important that you just know what quadrant it is in. The second thing you want to do is figure out what is the value of the reference angle. Well, if this is 6 pi over 6 and this is 5 pi over 6, remember the reference angle is always between the terminal side and the closest x-axis. So if I'm going from 5 to 6 pi over 6, this would have to be pi over 6. So I know my reference angle is pi over 6. Again, kind of a little hint is whatever this denominator is what this reference angle will be. So if this was 5 pi over 4, your reference angle would be pi over 4. If this was 3 pi over 5, your reference angle would be pi over 5. It's important, however, that you do draw it out so that you know what quadrant your angle is in. The next thing you do is you have to figure out what is the sine of the reference angle, and in this case, the reference angle is pi over 6. So this is where it's important that you know your first quadrant, sine, cosine, and tangent, and radians and degrees. So I know pi over 6 is the same thing as the sine of 30 degrees. And I memorized that the sine of 30 degrees is 1/2. So now I know that the sine of 5 pi over 6 is going to be the same as the sine of 30 degrees, which is 1/2. But what I don't know is that positive 1/2 or negative 1/2. So now if you remember, we have all students take calculus. In quadrant 2, only the sign is positive. I'm asking for the sign, so I know it'll be positive 1/2. So now I know that the sine of 5 pi over 6 equals 1/2, and that is my answer without using my calculator or looking at my unit circle. Now, if I wanted to check my answer, I could find my unit circle, which is right here, and I can look at it. 5 pi over 6 is up here. This is cosine sine, and in fact, 1/2 is correct.